All right. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. Good afternoon or morning, depending on where you are sitting. My name is Adina Glencher, and I will be your training facilitator today. I am a senior HR advisor here at PayEntry. Prior to beginning the presentation, I do want to state that this training does not constitute legal advice. We're going to go into that in a disclaimer on our next slide. If you do have any questions about the content of the training, please don't hesitate to reach out. You can contact me directly at the email address listed toward the top of the slide, or you can reach out to our HR services team by emailing hrservices@payentry.com. All right, now let's get into our disclaimers so we can get started. Our webinars are intended for educational purposes only. While we hope the information presented is helpful to you in understanding the topic, please remember that those presenting this webinar are not attorneys. The information provided during the presentation and the Q&A session should not be construed as legal advice. All right, so why are we here? Today we're going to be discussing the what, why, and how when it comes to progressive discipline. So we're going to review our agenda first. First, we will discuss what progressive discipline is. We'll talk through we'll talk through progressive discipline in the workplace and review the steps and the documentation associated with the process. We're going to discuss the progressive discipline meeting. We'll review why progressive discipline is an important practice to utilize, and we'll go into how to successfully implement a progressive discipline process, where we will review guidelines and best practices. And lastly, we will end our session with a Q&A, as we always do during our Thursday webinars. All right, so first let's look into what progressive discipline is by reviewing some definitions. So discipline comes from the root word disciple, which can mean to change one's behavior. If we approach the disciplinary process as a way to actually change an employee's behavior rather than just paperwork or a way to get somebody in trouble, the results can be greatly enhanced. Discipline can be a form of teaching, which I think is something that is commonly misconstrued. Progressive discipline is a method of discipline that involves taking disciplinary steps with employees where the consequences increase in severity if performance issues and/or violations continue. The ultimate objective of the progressive discipline process is to help employees correct conduct problems and resolve performance issues in the earliest stages. And I see somebody did type in that the handout's not working, so I'll make sure to send that out at the end. I apologize for that. If anyone else is having issues, please let me know. All right. So some scenarios that may require disciplinary action include violation of company policies, insubordination, theft or dishonesty, harassment, poor attendance, poor performance, and unauthorized possession of firearms. Of course, this is not an all-inclusive list, and that picture just cracked me up, so I had to include that during the presentation today. So we have defined progressive discipline, so let's look at when we may use it in the workplace. So as we discussed, progressive discipline is a common practice employers use to deal with employee behavior issues, performance issues, and/or violations of company policy. Each employee has an obligation to observe and follow the company policies and standards of conduct. Which is why it's so important to have an employee handbook or a policy manual or something that actually tells your employees what your company policies and standards of conduct are. If an employee fails to follow the company's policies and standards of conduct, then corrective disciplinary measures should be taken. So as you can see in the below diagram, disciplinary action may include verbal warnings, written warnings, suspension, and discharge or termination of employment. The appropriate disciplinary action imposed will be determined by the company, so it is important that the company does not guarantee that one form of action will necessarily precede another. And we're going to go into this in just a little bit, but we don't want to promise an employee that if X behavior happens, they will be given a verbal or or a written, etc., because things may differ based on a case-by-case basis. All right. So let's further review the steps that make up the progressive discipline process. So once again, steps may include a verbal warning, also known as a counseling, written warnings, a final warning, and or a suspension, we'll go over that, and termination. The progressive discipline process may very well vary slightly from company to company, but it's generally made up of those steps outlined on your left. So it is important to note that consistency within your company is key. We always say that in HR, but with progressive discipline, it's even more important, I think. Employers should have a progressive discipline policy outlined for their managers and supervisors to use as a management tool. This will help ensure consistency. And it will help, in doing so, will ensure consistency within the company as a whole. It is not recommended to have a written progressive discipline policy that is published and or distributed to employees because an inaccurate or poorly written policy may jeopardize the employment at will relationship. So oftentimes you will see employee handbooks have some kind of progressive discipline policy that just says something along the lines of progressive discipline may occur. That's fine, but we don't want to have a policy that outlines what's going to happen depending on each behavior and what might occur. So although consistency is extremely important, often no two situations look alike in HR, and situations need to be handled on a case-by-case basis. By distributing a detailed policy to your employees, an employer can easily get into a situation where their hands are tied, as they must follow the policy exactly as it is written. So a policy is important, but it's also important to keep it vague. Clear as mud, right? All right, so let's start by digging into the verbal warning step. So this is generally the first step in our progressive discipline policy, or our progressive discipline process, excuse me. A verbal warning is often a verbal conversation between a supervisor and an employee and is followed up with written documentation that should be placed in the employee's personnel file. So although this conversation is often just a conversation, we do want to document it. This documentation should include the date of the issue/deficiency. It should include the nature of the issue. It should include content of the meeting and conversation, as well as plans for improvement. And it should contain a manager and or supervisor signature. So this picture on the right is just an example of what a verbal warning template may look like. With the verbal warning, a formal template isn't necessarily required. So if you have a manager who just writes a quick memo or just writes something and signs it off, that could be fine if you're okay with that from a company perspective. Whatever works best for you, you don't necessarily need a formal memo like this. It's not necessary or common for the employee to review or sign the documented verbal warning. This documentation is typically just for the supervisor and company records and should be put in the employee's personnel file. Also, a copy of the verbal warning is not necessarily provided to the employee because they don't know we're even doing it. We're really just having a conversation with them. The documentation part is just for our records. So there's usually no reason for them to receive a copy. All right. Next step in the process is generally a written warning. A written warning should occur when a verbal warning fails to correct a performance or behavioral problem, or if the infraction was severe enough to actually skip a verbal warning and we go straight into a written warning. A written warning should include many of the same things as a verbal warning, including the date of the issue/deficiency, the nature of the issue. It should include dates of prior warnings regarding the same or similar offense, so such as the date you had that verbal conversation. It should include contents of the meeting and conversation, plans for improvement, and consequences that may transpire if improvement does not occur. And a written warning should contain both an employee and a manager or supervisor signature. It is important that you do request that signature from your employee on written warnings. So this picture on the right is another example of what a template may look like. You can see this one is a little bit more robust as it is for a written warning, not a verbal. And we do have template forms you can use. So if you need one, please reach out to myself or our HR team at the end of the presentation. I will provide that contact information again. Unlike a verbal warning, a written warning does need to be signed by both people, as I mentioned. And I do want to state that the purpose of the employee's signature is to confirm receipt and understanding. It's not necessarily to indicate agreement with the content of the document. So oftentimes, oops, I see that people lost the sound. Can anyone hear me? Let's see. Okay, I'm getting a kind of mixed review. Okay, wonderful, wonderful. Thank you for the feedback. So what I was saying was that the signature does not indicate agreement. Most people, unfortunately, don't always agree with their infractions. So if an employee refuses to sign the written warning, which may very well happen, it's quite common, just let your employee know that you understand they are refusing to sign, but the warning is still in place. So them refusing to sign doesn't just ignore the problem. And then make sure that you note that the employee actually refused to sign on the employee's signature line. If the employee refuses to sign, you may also want to allow them with an opportunity to provide you with a written rebuttal. Make sure if they decide to do that, that you keep that document with the warning form as it acts as an acknowledgement that the meeting did indeed take place. And then lastly, a copy of the written warning should be kept in the employee's personnel file, and a copy should be offered to the employee. Sometimes employees will say, no, I don't want it, but it's important that we do offer them a copy of the written warning as well. All right. So once an employee has received both verbal and written warnings, or if the circumstances are severe enough, you may decide to take more drastic measures if the problem is still not corrected. In that case, a final written warning and or a suspension may be appropriate. So a final warning may be accompanied with the suspension. However, it's not always required. And I often see companies don't use suspensions, but it is an option. The final warning should indicate that termination may follow if there is another infraction. So one thing you will hear all of us in HR say, or at least in our HR services department, is a termination should never be a surprise. And I know Kathy reviewed that last week during her termination webinar. Either an employee did something so egregious to warrant immediate termination, or you've spoken to the employee many times through this progressive discipline process about the issue, and honestly, they should be expecting termination if improvements are not made. So that's what this final warning step is really for. Before you suspend an employee, if you decide to do so, make sure you consider potential wage and hour issues that may arise. For example, non-exempt employees may be suspended with or without pay depending on your company policy, but it may be more difficult to suspend an exempt employee. So make sure you contact our HR services team for any questions you have regarding suspending employees, so we can help assist you in avoiding any wage and hour violations or risks. Perfect. And then the final step of the progressive discipline process is termination. And our goal is to not get to this step, right? Our goal is to coach our employees to improve. But unfortunately, we all know that sometimes that doesn't happen, and we do have to terminate our employees. So when all prior attempts to improve performance or correct undesirable behavior have failed, or the severity of the incident warrants immediate dismissal, termination is the final step. There are many things to consider prior to terminating an employee, and we can absolutely help mitigate your risks. So contact us if you need any assistance or you just want to run through a situation prior to initiating a termination. All right, so we have a lot of information on this slide, but I couldn't condense it. I think all of this is very important. Progressive discipline is generally part of the management process or managing employees that managers and supervisors like to avoid, right? These conversations are not comfortable for anybody. They're not fun to initiate, they're not fun to lead or participate in. However, they are crucial to running a successful business and ensuring employee success. So some best practices to consider include conduct the meeting in private, right? Don't issue a written warning in the middle of your sales floor. Consider having a witness present. Generally, this should occur for final warnings and terminations, but it may occur for steps earlier on in the process. The witness should be a supervisor, manager, or somebody in an executive role, or of course, human resources. One thing that people often don't consider is your positioning. So it's important to position yourself in a way that allows you to be at the same physical level as the employee. This is something I learned early on in my career. Don't stand while they sit. No one likes being talked down to, right? So make sure that if you're sitting in a chair, or if your employee's sitting in a chair, you're sitting in a chair, or even sitting lower than the employee. It sounds silly, but it could really make a difference. Another thing about positioning, allow the employee to sit closest to the door. You want to make sure that your employee is comfortable, or as comfortable as possible, and that they can leave the room that you're in if they are not feeling comfortable. Make sure you have clear goals. Make sure you come prepared with notes so you don't miss anything. Begin the meeting appropriately, or in a less kind way. Get to the point. Don't start the meeting with small talk, asking about their weekend. Thank the employee for their time, and then just begin the discussion. Make sure you do clearly state the problem and outline your expectations. Ensure two-way communication, so it shouldn't just be a one-way conversation. You should let the employee respond and actually listen to what they have to say. Remain calm. Look, no one likes being disciplined. Employees will often get angry or demonstrate a variety of emotions. I've seen employees like to throw things or cry, or it can get pretty intense. So it is important that you are calm during the situation and during the conversation. Make sure you do time the meeting carefully. So do your best to schedule the meeting at a time that really minimizes embarrassment to the employee. Maybe you have a time when you have less employees present at your workplace, or just a better time to have these kinds of conversations. Try to avoid having the discussion at the end of day on a Friday. Kathy mentioned the same thing regarding termination meetings. This is because the employee will likely not be able to express any concerns until the following Monday, and no one wants to have all that anger build up over the weekend. Establish a follow-up plan. Set a day and time to meet with them again. Make the employee aware of the consequences if poor performance or misconduct continue. And then lastly, end the meeting on a positive note. So tell the employee you are confident they have the ability to correct the performance or the behavioral issue, and assure the employee that you are there to support them. All right, so we have reviewed what the progressive discipline process is and how to implement it. And you may be wondering why you should use progressive discipline and not just some other kind of disciplinary action. You may wonder, maybe this doesn't even apply to me. I operate in an at-will state, and that very well may be the case. But although you may operate in an at-will state, employers have potential exposure to discrimination claims and may be forced to defend their disciplinary actions. Documenting disciplinary actions can provide evidence that the company took lawful action and may help the company respond to allegations of discrimination by showing the employee was treated consistently with other employees under similar circumstances. So why use this? First and foremost, it provides a consistent, objective, and fair process for disciplining. It promotes open communication between a supervisor and their employee and can set guidelines for expected future performance. It can improve employee productivity by providing a written set of objectives. It can potentially increase employee retention by resolving issues. And lastly, it provides important documentation or a paper trail should a termination become necessary. You then have proof that you did indeed have conversations and that you did your best to work with the employee to improve prior to simply terminating. All right, so some guidelines and best practices to consider include the progressive discipline process is not a one-size-fits-all approach. So although we outlined a few steps, your company may choose to have 2 verbal warnings before going to a written warning if it is attendance related, etc. So it's important that you meet with your management team to develop a process and ensure consistency. You should discuss things such as, how many incidents of a certain nature need to occur before you actually give a verbal warning? Some managers like to be able to just say, hey, employee, you need to fix this, very casually rather than doing an official verbal. How many written warnings will you provide prior to presenting a final warning? Sometimes businesses choose to do one, sometimes it's 3. It can vary depending on what the behavior issue is. And then what are some other steps that you might consider that we didn't discuss today? Maybe training or a performance improvement plan or transfers or something else is included in your process. Make sure that you thoroughly investigate each situation. This includes obtaining the employee's explanation or response prior to administering discipline. So I learned this the hard way, unfortunately. In my first HR role, I was told that an employee did something wrong. I went into a room with them ready to issue a verbal warning, issued the verbal warning, only to find out that I didn't have the whole story. So make sure that you actually have what I like to call a seek to understand conversation with the employee prior to just assuming that things are done incorrectly. Maybe it's something obvious, like they're not meeting your performance requirements, but maybe they weren't trained properly. So make sure that you do meet with the employee to gain some information prior to just issuing discipline. Consider whether the employee has been made aware of the performance and behavioral standards, what we just talked about. Be timely. So this one is a lot more important than it sounds. The more time that actually separates undesirable behavior and its consequences, the less effective the discipline will be. So for example, let's say all of the month of April, so all this month you had an employee who was tardy every day, and you chose to not bring this up until their annual review in December. Chances are the employee won't even remember that they were late every day in the month of April, right? Half of us can't even remember what we ate for breakfast yesterday. But the employee is probably not going to take you seriously if you waited, X amount of months to really have this conversation. So if behaviors are not addressed in a timely fashion, employees will just assume they're doing things right. If no one says anything, they're going to assume that what they're doing is okay with you. I can't tell you how many times I get calls from clients stating that their employees are having attendance or performance issues and that they want to terminate them. But after a more in-depth conversation, we find out that they've never even spoken to the employee about these issues. Make sure that you provide objective reasons for the discipline, not subjective reasons. So, example of a subjective reason may be the employee has a bad attitude. We're writing an employee up for having a bad attitude. Well, a bad attitude to you and a bad attitude to me may differ in definition, but it's also hard to measure a bad attitude, right? So an objective example, and one that we would want to include in the documentation, would be the employee interrupted the speaker several times, rolled their eyes at the customer, and stated, "This is a waste of time," under their breath. So we want more objective details added. If an employee is often late, we know, for example, don't state the employee was late one day. Tell me the day they were late, how late they were, etc. The more detailed, the better. Make sure we are focusing on the behavior, not the employee. We don't want to, pick favorites and least favorites. It may be acceptable to repeat or skip steps in the process, and this may just depend on your company and what you guys decide to do. And be consistent. So make sure you are consistent with disciplinary action taken for similar circumstances. If you're not consistent, you may open your company up to the possibility of discrimination claims. If you call myself or my team and you say you want to terminate somebody for a behavior, the first thing or second thing we're going to generally ask you is, do you have a past precedent to consider? Has this happened before? All right. And that concludes the presentation. So thank you all for joining me. I hope everyone did learn something new. Let's take a look at our question box to see if we had any questions come in during the presentation. All right. I don't see any questions yet. I just see that the handout was not working, so I will make note of who is here and try to send that out. Let me just check one more time. All right. I don't see any questions. So thank you again for joining. Don't forget to join us next Thursday for our weekly webinar. We will be discussing ADA, FMLA, and workers' compensation, the Bermuda Triangle of leaves. And my contact information is at that bottom of that screen. If anyone has any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out.